The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban neighborhood when the sound of metal stakes hammering into soil shattered the calm. James Carter, 68 years old, stepped onto his porch in confusion. His yard, his sanctuary, his home was crawling with two men in neon vests, pounding wooden stakes deep into the earth as if marking a grave. "Hey!" James's voice cracked with both anger and disbelief. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" One of the surveyors didn't even look up. He shoved another stake into the dirt and scribbled on his clipboard. The other smirked as he straightened, meeting James's glare. "This isn't your property anymore, sir. HOA records say otherwise." James blinked, stunned. The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence. "My wife and I built this home. I paid every cent of the mortgage. You don't get to waltz in here and claim it." His voice trembled, but there was steel beneath it. The surveyor shrugged, tapping his stake with a smug rhythm. "Paperwork doesn't lie. As far as the board's concerned, this land belongs to the association now. We're just here to map out what's already theirs." James's fists clenched. Behind him, the front door creaked as he stepped inside. Moments later, he re-emerged, gripping a weathered envelope inside, the original deed to his home. His late wife's handwriting still lingered in the margins. "Not yours. Not now. Not ever." He held it up like a shield. The surveyor chuckled under his breath. "Good luck convincing anyone in court. Deeds get lost, papers get challenged. The HOA has more lawyers than you can afford. And maybe for de present of no from snow." James's jaw tightened. He turned the envelope in his hands, then pulled out his phone. "We'll see who really owns this land." James's finger hovered over the call button, the stakes still jutting from his soil like spears in enemy territory. James Carter stood on his porch long after the surveyors drove away, the sound of their hammers still echoing in his ears. His home had never felt so fragile. For 35 years, it had been his anchor, the place where he and his late wife, Gloria, raised their children, celebrated holidays, and weathered storms both literal and personal. Every brick carried a memory, and every corner of the yard reminded him of her laughter. Now, strangers were trying to erase all of that with a few stakes in the ground. Would you fight back if someone tried to steal your home? Let us know in the comments. Comment where you are watching from, and keep watching, because this story is only getting started. James was well known in the neighborhood. He was the man who always waved first, who lent his tools without hesitation, who kept his garden neat and his porch light on for neighbors in need. People respected him, though not everyone had the courage to stand up against the HOA that had begun tightening its grip on the community. The president of that association, a man named Richard Grayson, had a reputation for arrogance wrapped in a smile. He fancied himself a businessman, someone who protected property values, but everyone knew his true goal: control. He thrived on intimidation, issuing fines for the smallest of infractions: grass an inch too high, a trash can left visible, a car parked slightly outside the line. To Richard, rules were weapons. It was no surprise then, when he appeared later that afternoon, polished shoes clicking up James's driveway. With him were two board members, holding clipboards like shields. "Mr. Carter," Richard began, voice syrupy with false courtesy, "there seems to be a clerical adjustment regarding your lot. The association records show a discrepancy. To put it simply, this house is on HOA property." James narrowed his eyes. "This is my home, Richard. I've got the deed and the receipts to prove it, paid in full. You know that." Richard's smile sharpened. "Paperwork can be tricky. Records get updated. Boundaries shift. We have surveyors, lawyers, the resources to resolve this properly. It's best for you to cooperate." The word cooperate stung like a threat. James stood his ground. "I'm not going anywhere." Richard's smile vanished, his mask slipping for a moment. "Then we'll proceed with legal channels. I assure you, we will reclaim what belongs to the association." The three men turned and walked away, leaving James gripping the worn envelope that contained his deed. His knuckles whitened, his heartbeat quickened. That evening, as the sun set behind his garden, James sat on his porch, staring at the old fireproof box he had pulled from the back of his closet. Inside were decades of carefully kept records, mortgage payments, tax receipts, the original deed signed in his and Gloria's names. He opened the box slowly, running his fingers across the faded ink. These papers weren't just documents, they were his life, proof of the sacrifices he and his wife had made. Still, a gnawing doubt crept in. Could paperwork really be enough against men with power and money? As he pondered, a gentle voice called from across the fence. Mrs. Lopez, his longtime neighbor, leaned over, her brow furrowed. "James, I saw those surveyors. You need to be careful. Richard's been circling families like a hawk. He's forcing people out one by one. Don't let him scare you." James managed a weary smile. "I won't. This is my home." But as he closed the box and set it on the table beside him, the weight of what was coming pressed heavily on his chest. He knew Richard Grayson wouldn't stop, and deep down, he feared this battle had only just begun. The next morning, James awoke to find a bright orange envelope taped to his front door. Bold letters across the top read, "Notice of violation." His stomach sank. He tore it open. Unapproved lawn ornamentation. Failure to comply will result in daily fines. James glanced at the yard. The so-called violation? The small angel statue Gloria had placed by the rose bushes 20 years ago, a quiet memorial after her passing. His hands trembled. They were targeting her memory now. Later that week, another notice appeared. This one claimed his paint color was not in line with association guidelines. Then came one for his trash can being visible for more than 10 minutes after pickup. The letters piled up, each one demanding money. Each one carrying the same cold, printed signature, HOA Board of Compliance. At first, James thought it was harassment meant to scare him. But then the surveyors returned, driving more stakes into his backyard, measuring, mapping, marking. They didn't look at him anymore. To them, he was already gone. One afternoon, James stormed out, his voice raw. "I told you men before, get off my property." One surveyor chuckled without even lifting his head. "Not your property. We're just doing our job." The other smirked. "Better get used to it, old man. You won't be here much longer." James's fists clenched, but he forced himself back inside. Losing his temper wouldn't win this fight. That evening, his doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Lopez again, holding a casserole dish, her eyes soft with concern. "James, they're circling you like vultures. Richard's been doing this for years, pushing people out, then flipping their homes for profit. They act like the HOA owns the whole neighborhood." James sighed. "They don't own this. Gloria and I built this with our blood and sweat." Mrs. Lopez placed the dish in his hands. "Then don't let them take it." But not all neighbors were so supportive. As James stood in his yard the next day, another resident, Mr. Kelly, approached nervously. "James, maybe you should just settle. These people don't lose. I've seen them drag families through the mud. You don't want to end up with nothing." James shook his head. "If I give up, they'll only go after the next family. Someone has to stand their ground." That night, under the flickering glow of his porch light, James opened his fireproof box again. He spread the documents across the table, the mortgage receipts, the signed deed, the tax records. He whispered as though speaking to Gloria, "I've kept everything, love. They can't erase us." But as his eyes drifted across the stack, a chill ran down his spine. Each paper was intact, but would that matter in a system where the HOA controlled lawyers, judges, and influence? Days later, the fight escalated further. A uniformed courier delivered a thick packet to his doorstep, a court summons. The HOA had officially filed a claim of ownership, alleging that James was trespassing on HOA land. He read the words over and over, each sentence tightening a knot in his chest. They weren't bluffing anymore. James lowered the papers slowly, the silence of his house pressing in on him. His heart pounded, but his resolve hardened. They thought he was alone. They thought he was weak, but they were about to discover that James Carter had something they hadn't counted on. Something stronger than intimidation, louder than their threats, and far more dangerous than their greed. The days that followed were suffocating. James couldn't walk to his mailbox without finding another letter from the HOA. Each one was colder than the last warnings, demands, legal notices. What began as harassment had now sharpened into a blade pressed against his throat. The thick packet on his kitchen table was the worst of all, the lawsuit. The words blurred as he read them aloud in disbelief. Claim of encroachment, reclassification of property, petition for removal of trespasser. Trespasser. That was the word they had used. In his own home. James lowered the papers, his chest tight. He'd lived through decades of hard labor at the steel mill, through the loss of his beloved wife, through nights when money was scarce but dignity remained. But never had he felt so powerless. At the hearing date stamped on the summons, he saw the deadline looming like a storm cloud. He had less than 2 weeks to respond. Without a lawyer, he knew the board would devour him alive in court. Sleep grew impossible. Each creak of his old house felt like an omen. Every letter from the HOA, another nail in a coffin they were building around him. Even his friends had begun to pull away. Some were too afraid to cross the HOA, others convinced he couldn't win. One night, his phone rang. He answered with hope, but the voice on the other end chilled him. It was Richard Grayson. "You're an honorable man, James," Richard said, his tone mocking. "You've worked hard. You've lived a good life. Don't let this end ugly. Sell willingly, and we'll make sure you walk away with something. Fight us, and you'll walk away with nothing." James's hand shook as he gripped the phone. "This house isn't just wood and nails, Richard. It's my life, my wife's memory, my children's childhood. You'll have to bury me before you take it." Richard chuckled, low and cruel. "That can be arranged." The line went dead. James set the phone down slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked at the walls around him, the photographs of his children, the faded curtains Gloria had sewn with her own hands. His home was no longer just under threat, it was under siege. He slumped into his chair, the weight of it all pressing down. But as he sat there, staring at the lawsuit papers spread across his table, another thought surfaced, one that burned with quiet defiance. "I am not alone. Not completely." James reached for an old photo on the mantel, his son Andre, in uniform, standing tall on the day he shipped off for service. Andre hadn't been home in years, their conversations reduced to brief phone calls and holiday greetings. James missed him deeply. He whispered into the silence of the room, "I wish you were here, son." Outside, the wind rattled the surveyor stakes still standing in his lawn, markers of a battle closing in. James didn't know it yet, but his whispered wish was about to be answered in a way that would change everything. The following Saturday, James sat slumped on the porch, staring at the surveyor stakes that scarred his lawn. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, his thoughts heavier than the clouds rolling overhead. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten much either. Every letter, every threat, every fine had stripped him thinner and thinner until he felt hollow. Then, the familiar growl of an engine pulled into his driveway. James looked up, squinting as a black pickup truck rolled to a stop. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. James blinked, his heart skipping. "Dad," the man said, voice firm but warm. It was Andre, dressed in a fitted jacket and boots. His posture still carried the unmistakable sharpness of the Marine Corps. He crossed the driveway in 3 long strides, before James could even set his cup down. Father and son embraced tightly, the kind of embrace that dissolved years of distance in an instant. James's throat tightened. "Andre, what are you doing here?" "I heard what's happening," Andre replied, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the yard. He noticed the stakes, the papers stacked on the porch table. "They're trying to steal your home, our home," James sighed. "I didn't want to drag you into this. You've already sacrificed enough serving this country. This is my fight." Andre shook his head. "Then it's mine too. Nobody threatens my father and gets away with it." Almost on cue, Richard Grayson appeared at the end of the street, striding with 2 board members toward James's property. His expression was smug, confident, as though he already knew the outcome of this war. "James," Richard called, spreading his arms in mock welcome. "I hope you've reconsidered my offer. It's not too late to end this peacefully." James rose, but before he could speak, Andre stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Peaceful? You've been harassing an elderly man, fining him for nonsense, trespassing on his land and filing false claims. That ends today." Richard's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "And you are?" Andre squared his shoulders. "Captain Andre Carter, United States Marine Corps, and you're about to regret thinking my father was alone." For the first time, Richard's confident mask cracked. He shifted uneasily as Andre pulled a folder from under his arm, documents he had already obtained through military legal contacts. He held them up for everyone to see. "These are property records from the county registrar, certified, sealed, and undeniable. This house belongs to James Carter, my father. Any claim otherwise is fraud." Richard's board members exchanged nervous glances. The smug certainty drained from their faces as Andre's words carried like thunder. James watched, pride swelling in his chest. For weeks, he had felt cornered, beaten down, outnumbered, but now, standing at his side was a force Richard couldn't intimidate, a son who had faced wars and refused to flinch in the face of tyranny. And for the first time, James believed he could win. The camera sweeps across the packed courtroom. Tension hangs heavy in the air. HOA board members sit smugly in their tailored suits, exchanging whispers, confident the verdict will bend their way. At the defense table, James Carter sits tall but weary, clutching the weathered deed like a lifeline. Beside him, Andre Carter, his Marine son, rises with the calm precision of a soldier, his gaze locked on the opposition. "Your Honor," Andre begins, voice steady, "this is the original deed, signed, sealed, and registered long before the HOA ever existed." He places the aged document on the evidence desk. The ink may have faded, but the authenticity radiates through every word. The HOA's attorney smirks. Paperwork gets lost. Things change. Andre doesn't flinch. Not when the signatures on your so-called documents don't match. He flips open a binder, revealing blown-up comparisons of signatures. One by one, the jury watches as the ink trails betray their secrets. The HOA's documents are riddled with inconsistencies, shaky lines, mismatched strokes, clumsy forgeries. Andre steps closer to the witness stand, where one of the surveyors sits, suddenly pale. "You filed these maps, didn't you?" "Yes," the man mutters. "And you swore they were based on official HOA records." "War, yes." Andre slams another exhibit down emails, quietly subpoenaed, showing the surveyor was instructed to alter lot lines. "So, you knowingly falsified property boundaries?" The surveyor's voice cracks. I just did what I was told." The jury murmurs. The judge leans forward. The HOA president, seated at the front, tugs at his collar, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Andre doesn't stop. He turns, looking directly at the bench. "Your Honor, this wasn't a one-time scheme. The HOA attempted this same land grab against at least 5 other families in the neighborhood." Gasps ripple through the courtroom. The HOA's smug confidence vanishes. Their lawyer jumps to his feet, objecting furiously, but the damage is already done. The courtroom was packed tighter than James Carter had ever seen. Neighbors whispered in the back rows, some siding with the HOA, others quietly rooting for the man who had lived in the same home for over 3 decades. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his weathered hands gripping the original deed, the same envelope he had pulled from his home that morning. Beside him sat his son, Andre Carter, posture sharp, the Marine Corps insignia on his jacket, sending an unspoken message: this family would not be bullied. Across the aisle, the HOA board members looked smug, guarded by a wall of lawyers. Their lead attorney stood tall, waving around corrected surveys and title adjustments that supposedly proved the land belonged to the association. When the judge entered, silence dropped over the room. The HOA attorney wasted no time, painting James as a stubborn old man clinging to outdated paperwork. "This is about progress," he said smoothly. "The records prove ownership lies with the association." "It's a Ben." But then James rose. His back ached, but his voice carried. "This house was not given to me. My wife and I built it, every nail, every wall, every stone in that garden. I buried her from that very doorstep. And now these men dare tell me it was never ours." He slid the deed forward, placing it gently on the judge's bench. The paper was faded, but the signatures were clear. Along the margin, his late wife's familiar handwriting glimmered like a ghost. The HOA lawyer scoffed. "Obsolete paperwork, Your Honor. Legally meaningless." That's when Andre stood up. His voice cut the air with the command of a Marine sergeant. "Meaningless? That's my mother's handwriting. That's my father's sweat in every brick. And unlike your fabricated documents, this one hasn't been forged to steal land from a man you thought was too old to fight back." A murmur swept across the courtroom. The judge's brows furrowed, eyes narrowing at the HOA's counsel. James steadied himself, laying a hand on Andre's arm. "They thought I was alone," he said softly, "but they didn't count on my son. He fought for this country, and he'll fight to protect this home." The smugness drained from the board's faces. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. The judge leaned forward. Unless the HOA produces unquestionable proof of ownership, this court sees no grounds to remove Mr. Carter from his property. The HOA lawyers fumbled their papers, their confidence unraveling. The gallery gasped, some even applauding under their breath. James exhaled slowly, his chest heavy with relief. Andre placed a steadying hand on his father's shoulder, grounding him in the storm. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to believe. Justice was within reach. The gavel struck once more, echoing like thunder. The court recognizes James Carter as the rightful and legal owner of the property, the judge declared. All claims by the Homeowners Association are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, this court will open inquiry into the HOA's conduct regarding fraudulent surveys and harassment of Mr. Carter. The gallery erupted. Neighbors who had stayed silent for fear of the HOA now cheered, some even clapping openly. Others looked ashamed for not standing up sooner. At the defense table, the HOA board sat frozen, their arrogance shattered. The lead lawyer shuffled papers, but his arguments had been gutted. The board president whispered something under his breath, face pale as defeat washed over him. James Carter slumped into his seat, tears welling in his tired eyes. He had stood against the machine and won. Beside him, Andre tightened his grip on his father's shoulder. "You did it, Dad," he said quietly. James shook his head, smiling through the tears. "No, son, we did." Outside the courthouse, cameras and reporters swarmed. Andre shielded his father with his arm, guiding him past the flashing lights. The once intimidated neighbors approached, apologizing for their silence and promising to support James from now on. For the first time, the balance of power in the community had shifted. Later that evening, back on his porch, James stood where it had all begun, the stakes still scattered in the yard like broken spears. But now, the yard was quiet, safe. His home was his again. Andre walked up beside him, gazing at the horizon. "They won't come back after this," he said firmly. James nodded, staring at the house he and his late wife had built. This home, it's her memory, her spirit. They thought they could erase that with paperwork, but some things can't be erased. Andre placed a hand on his father's back. "And as long as I'm here, no one's taking it from you again." The two stood side by side as the sun set, the house glowing gold in the fading light. A quiet victory, but one that echoed louder than the HOA could have ever imagined. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another homeowner, but what they didn't count on was a father's resilience, a son's loyalty, and a truth written in ink that outlasted their lies. James Carter had fought for his home and won, and for the HOA, it was a loss they would instantly regret. Would you stand up like James did, even against powerful people? Comment your answer below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of resilience, family, and justice.